Carol Bryant had been awake for 19 hours when the call came through. He sat in the cramped break room of Station 47, nursing his fourth cup of coffee, the bitter liquid doing little to warm him against the December chill that seeped through the old building's walls. Outside, snow fell in heavy curtains across the city, coating everything in deceptive white. The kind of Christmas Eve scene that belonged on greeting cards, not in the life of the paramedic who'd already responded to 3 overdoses, a car accident, and a domestic violence call that left a woman with a shattered cheekbone. At 41, Carol had the kind of face that told stories without speaking. A thin scar ran through his left eyebrow from an incident 6 years ago when a meth addict had come at him with a broken bottle. His hands, large and capable, bore the calluses of someone who'd spent 20 years pulling people back from the edge of death. There was gray at his temples now, more than there'd been last year, and lines around his eyes that deepened when he smiled. Those smiles had become rare these past months. He checked his phone for the dozenth time. No messages from Hannah. No photos of their daughter, Emma, opening presents. Just silence, the kind that had become suffocating in their marriage. "Bryant, you should eat something." Marcus Webb, his partner for the night shift, dropped a wrapped sandwich onto the table. Marcus was 10 years younger, still idealistic enough to believe the job wouldn't eventually hollow him out. "You look like hammered shit. Appreciate the poetry." Carol unwrapped the sandwich anyway. Turkey on wheat. It tasted like cardboard. "Your kid at your in-laws' place tonight?" Carol's jaw tightened. "Yeah, the Mays family Christmas tradition. Wouldn't miss it for the world." The sarcasm dripped like poison. Marcus knew better than to push. Everyone at the station knew about Carol's in-laws. The Mays family owned half the commercial real estate in the county, sat on hospital boards and charity committees, attended galas where a single table cost more than Carol made in 3 months. They were the kind of people who smiled for cameras while stepping on necks behind closed doors. What nobody knew, what Carol had never told anyone, was how bad it had gotten. 8 years ago, Carol Bryant had been a different man. Younger, certainly, but more than that, hopeful. He'd met Hannah Mays at a community fundraiser for the fire department, where she'd been volunteering out of what he later learned was an obligation her father imposed on all his children. Good optics, Jan Mays called it, making the family look charitable while teaching them to view the working class as props in their performance of nobility. Hannah had been different then, or maybe Carol had just wanted to believe she was different. She'd laughed at his jokes, touched his arm when she spoke to him, looked at him like he was more than the sum of his tax returns. By the time he realized she was rebelling against her family rather than genuinely falling for him, Emma was already 2 years old, and leaving meant losing his daughter. "My father will destroy you in court," Hannah had said flatly during one of their arguments. "You'll get supervised visits twice a month, and Emma will grow up knowing you abandoned her." So Carol stayed. Not for Hannah. That love had curdled into something bitter years ago. But for Emma, his daughter, now 8 years old, with his dark hair and her mother's green eyes, a brilliant little girl who loved dinosaurs and astronomy and still believed her daddy could fix anything. He couldn't fix this marriage, but he could endure it until Emma was old enough to understand. The Mays family home, calling it a house, felt inadequate. Sprawled across 3 acres of prime real estate, a Georgian revival mansion that Jan Mays had inherited from his father and expanded with money that nobody in the family could fully account for. Tonight, it blazed with lights, every window glowing, a massive Christmas tree visible through the front parlor's picture window. Hannah pulled into the circular driveway at precisely 6 o'clock, as commanded. Beside her, Emma clutched a small wrapped gift, a drawing she'd made for her grandmother, painstakingly colored with every shade of pencil she owned. "Remember the rules," Hannah said without looking at her daughter. "Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't ask for seconds. Don't mention your father. Mom, why doesn't Daddy come to Christmas anymore?" "Because he's working." The lie came easily. The truth, that Jan Mays had banned Carol from the property 3 years ago after Carol had the audacity to suggest that Jan's old-fashioned discipline of screaming at a 6-year-old for spilling juice was abusive, was not something Hannah would ever acknowledge. Emma knew something was wrong. Children always know. But at 8, She lacked the vocabulary to articulate the specific dread that settled in her stomach every time they turned onto this driveway. Inside, the Mays family had assembled like a tribunal. Jan Mays, 73, sat in his leather armchair like a king on a throne. He'd built his empire through ruthlessness that he called business sense, crushing competitors, exploiting legal loopholes, and maintaining an iron grip on everyone in his orbit. His wife, Ruth, sat beside him, a woman who'd learned decades ago that silence was survival. She embroidered. She gardened. She pretended not to notice the bruises that sometimes appeared on her grandchildren. Shane Mays, Hannah's older brother, stood by the fireplace with his wife, Candace. Shane had inherited his father's cruelty without his intelligence, a dangerous combination. At 45, he ran the family's property management company, which mostly meant he collected rent from people who couldn't afford to pay and felt powerful when he evicted them. Candace, a former debutante who'd married Shane for his money, had sharpened herself into a weapon of social warfare, all backhanded compliments and venomous smiles. Their children, twin teenagers named Bradley and Morgan, lounged on a sofa, faces illuminated by their phones, already learning to be cruel in their own petty ways. "There she is," Jan announced when Emma walked in. His voice was the same register he used in boardrooms, commanding, cold. The little mongrel. Emma flinched. She learned not to react visibly to her grandfather's insults, but her small hands tightened on her gift. "Father," Hannah said weakly. It was the most resistance she ever offered. "What? It's a joke. Can't the child take a joke?" Jan's lips curled. Probably gets that sensitivity from her father. The ambulance driver. "Paramedic," Emma whispered. The room went still. Jan's eyes narrowed. "What did you say?" "He's a paramedic, not an ambulance driver. He saves people's lives." Emma's voice trembled, but she held her grandfather's gaze with a courage that would have made Carol's heart burst with pride. It made Jan Mays's heart fill with rage. Dinner was served at 7. Emma sat at the children's end of the table, far from the adults, watched over by Bradley and Morgan, who'd been given implicit permission to torment her through their parents' indifference. She ate silently, carefully, trying to make herself invisible. It almost worked. Then Morgan, with the casual cruelty of a 15-year-old who'd never faced consequences, reached over and knocked Emma's plate onto the floor. The crash of porcelain silenced the table. "Clumsy," Morgan said, smirking. Emma's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the ruined food. Her grandmother's antique plate shattered on the hardwood. "That plate," Ruth Mays said, her voice quavering, "was from my mother's collection. I didn't," Emma started. "Enough." Jan's command cut through the air like a blade. He rose from his seat, and the entire family seemed to hold their breath. "You come into my home, insult me by defending that worthless father of yours, and then you destroy a family heirloom." "It was an accident," Hannah said, but her voice was barely audible. "Shane." Jan didn't look at his son. "Get the box." Something changed in the room. Even Candace, usually eager for drama, went pale. "Father," Shane said carefully, "maybe that's a bit." Did I stutter? "Get the box." The box was wooden, antique, kept in Jan's study. Inside, wrapped in velvet, were 18 steel nails, roofing nails specifically, their tips cruel and sharp. This was a Mays family tradition, though not one they ever discussed outside these walls. Jan's father had used it on him. Jan had used it on his children. Obedience through pain, he called it. Character building. "The girl needs to learn respect," Jan said as Shane arranged the nails in a row on the kitchen stone floor. "Hannah, you've clearly failed to teach her. So I will." Emma stood frozen, uncomprehending, as her mother looked away. "Kneel," Jan commanded, "and apologize for embarrassing this family, for bringing your father's inferior blood into our line, for every moment of shame you've caused." "Please," Emma whispered. "Please, I'm sorry, I didn't mean." "Kneel on those nails, apologize, and perhaps you'll earn your supper." Jan's voice held no anger now. It was worse than anger. It was calculation. "Or don't, and we'll see how stubborn you really are." Emma looked at her mother. Hannah was staring at the wall, her face blank, retreated to whatever mental bunker she'd built over years of this same treatment. No one would help her. At 8 years old, Emma Bryant knelt on 18 steel nails. 40 minutes. That's how long they made her stay there. 40 minutes of Christmas carols playing softly in the background, of adults returning to their meal as if nothing was happening, of Emma's small body trembling as blood pooled beneath her knees. She apologized. Over and over, she apologized. For things she hadn't done. For existing. For her father's blood in her veins. It was never enough. She's not sincere, Candace observed, sipping wine. You can hear it in her voice. Perhaps another 20 minutes, Jan agreed. At minute 38, Emma stopped speaking. At minute 40, her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed sideways onto the kitchen floor, unconscious. Bradley, passing through to get more soda, stepped over her body without looking down. Should we call someone? Ruth asked, her embroidery still in her hands. She's fine, Jan said. Dramatic, like her father. She'll wake up. They left her there, an 8-year-old girl, bleeding and unconscious on a cold stone floor, while they opened presents in the next room. Carol's phone rang at 11:47 p.m. It wasn't Hannah. It was Emma's number, the little flip phone he'd gotten her for emergencies, against Hannah's objections. Daddy. The voice was so small, so broken, that Carol's blood turned to ice. Emma? Baby, what's wrong? I woke up and everyone's asleep and my knees hurt so bad. Daddy, they hurt so bad, and there's blood everywhere. Carol was already on his feet, grabbing his keys. Emma, listen to me. Can you walk? Can you get to a bathroom? I think so. Daddy, I'm scared. I know, baby. I know. I'm coming. I need you to stay on the phone with me. Okay? Don't hang up. I'm coming right now. Marcus looked up from his magazine. Carol? What? But Carol was already gone, running through the snow to his truck, his daughter's sobs echoing through the phone pressed to his ear. He found her in the downstairs bathroom of the Mays mansion, curled on the tile floor, her Christmas dress stained with dried blood. The wounds on her knees were ugly, deep punctures that would scar. Carol didn't knock on the front door. He didn't announce himself. He picked the lock, a skill he'd learned in his teens, long before he'd become a paramedic, in a past life he rarely discussed, and moved through the darkened house like a ghost. When he lifted Emma into his arms, she clung to him with what little strength she had left. Don't let them see you, she whispered. They'll be so mad. Shoo. Carol carried her out through the back, into the snow, into his truck. He drove to the hospital where his co-workers worked, where they would ask questions he would have to answer carefully. In the waiting room, as Emma was taken back for treatment, Carol sat alone. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He didn't call the police. Not yet. He knew how that would go. The Mays family owned judges, owned prosecutors, owned the very institutions that were supposed to protect children like Emma. Instead, Carol Bryant did something far more dangerous. He began to think. By 3 a.m., Emma was sedated, her wounds cleaned and bandaged, her small body finally resting. The doctor, a woman named Alberta Berger, who'd known Carol for years, sat beside him in the hallway. Those wounds are consistent with kneeling on sharp objects for an extended period, she said quietly. Carol, I have to report this. I know. CPS will investigate. But, she hesitated. We both know how investigations involving wealthy families tend to go. Carol nodded. He knew exactly how they went. Lawyers would materialize. Statements would be clarified. Evidence would become ambiguous. By the time the system finished grinding through its processes, Emma would be back in that house, and the Mays family would be more careful about leaving marks. What are you going to do? Alberta asked. Carol looked at his hands. The same hands that had saved hundreds of lives, that had held dying strangers in the back of ambulances, that had felt his daughter's blood soaking through her dress. Whatever I have to, he said. The next morning, December 26th, Carol made 3 phone calls. The first was to an attorney named Jeremiah Blair, a man he'd saved from a heart attack 2 years ago. Jeremiah owed him. And more importantly, Jeremiah hated the Mays family for reasons he'd never fully explained. The second was to his brother, Orlando Long. Different fathers, same mother. A family complication that had kept them semi-estranged for years. Orlando worked in private investigation, the kind that didn't always color inside legal lines. The third was to Hannah. You have 24 hours to leave that house with divorce papers signed, Carol said. His voice was calm, utterly flat, the voice he used when telling families their loved ones hadn't made it. If you don't, I will destroy your family. Not metaphorically, literally. Every secret, every crime, every skeleton in every closet. I've been patient for 8 years, Hannah. I'm done being patient. Hannah's voice shook. You can't threaten. 24 hours. He hung up. Jeremiah Blair's office occupied the second floor of a converted brownstone, the kind of space that looked modest from outside, but hummed with expensive efficiency within. The attorney himself was 63, silver-haired, with the predatory patience of a man who'd spent decades learning where bodies were buried, sometimes literally. Carol arrived at 9 in the morning, coffee in hand, a folder tucked under his arm. You look like you haven't slept, Jeremiah observed. I haven't. Then let's make it worth staying awake. Jeremiah gestured to a chair. Tell me everything. Carol told him. The folder contained photographs he'd taken at the hospital. Emma's knees, the puncture wounds, the bruising. Medical records Alberta had quietly provided. Emma's own whispered account, recorded on Carol's phone while she was still lucid enough to speak. When Carol finished, Jeremiah was silent for a long moment. This is criminal child abuse, he finally said. Felony level in this state. I'm aware. So why aren't you at the police station? Carol's eyes met the attorney's. Because a report gets filed. Investigators come. The Mays family lawyers make phone calls. Charges get reduced or dropped. Best case scenario, Emma gets caught in a custody battle that drags on for years while my ex-wife poisons her against me. And worst case, I lose my daughter entirely and they do this again. Or worse. Jeremiah leaned back. So what do you want? I want them to pay. All of them. But I want to do it in a way that sticks. In a way they can't buy their way out of. The attorney studied Carol for a long time. There's something you're not telling me. Something about the Mays family specifically. Carol hesitated. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a second folder. Thicker, older, the edges worn. 3 years ago, when Jan banned me from the property, I started looking into him. I couldn't explain why at the time. Call it intuition. Call it paranoia. But I had a feeling that a man who'd scream at a 6-year-old over spilled juice had done worse things to other people. He slid the folder across the desk. I was right. Orlando Long arrived in town on December 27th, driving a truck that had seen better decades and carrying equipment that would make most law enforcement agencies nervous. He was Carol's half-brother, 8 years younger, built like a linebacker who'd found Jesus and then lost him again. Their mother had died when Orlando was 12, leaving him in foster care while Carol, already an adult, fought a system that refused to give him custody. By the time Orlando aged out, he'd learned skills that didn't appear on any resume. Now he used those skills for clients who could afford his rates and whose causes he deemed worthy. You look good, Orlando said, embracing his brother in the motel parking lot where they'd arranged to meet. You look like you've been living in that truck. Occasionally. Hotels are expensive, and I like the mobility. Orlando glanced around, his eyes cataloging exits and sight lines. You going to tell me what this is about? Or do I have to guess? Carol told him about Emma, about the nails, about the Mays family and their casual cruelty wrapped in Christmas lights. When he finished, Orlando's face had gone completely still. Where are they now? His voice was different. Harder. Don't. Carol gripped his brother's arm. That's not why I called you. If I wanted them hurt, I'd do it myself. I called you because I need information. Proof. Things I can't get through legal channels. Orlando exhaled slowly. What kind of things? Carol handed him a list. 5 names, 5 sets of notes. Jan Mays, patriarch, the one who ordered it. Shane Mays, his son, the one who set up the nails. Candace Mays, Shane's wife, she watched and commented like it was entertainment. Ruth Mays, the grandmother, didn't intervene, complicit through silence. And Hannah, my wife, Emma's mother, who let it happen to her own daughter. That last one's going to be complicated, Orlando noted. She's still technically your family. She stopped being my family when she let them torture my child. While Orlando began his work, Carol implemented the first phase of his plan. The Mays family's wealth was substantial, but it wasn't infinite, and it wasn't clean. Carol's 3 years of quiet research had revealed fractures in the foundation. Debts hidden through shell companies, code violations in their properties ignored through bribery, and most importantly, a pattern of cruelty that extended far beyond his own daughter. Jan Mays had built his empire by taking advantage of desperate people. Tenants who couldn't pay rent were evicted without proper notice. Workers who were injured on his construction sites found themselves mysteriously unable to file claims. And there were darker rumors, stories of young employees who disappeared from the company rolls after refusing Jan's special attention. Carol's first move was simple. He made a phone call. "Rodney," he said when the line connected. "It's Carol Bryant. I need a favor." Rodney Bonner was a building inspector for the county, a man Carol had pulled from a burning car 7 years ago. He'd lost his arm below the elbow in that accident, but he'd kept his life and his job. He remembered who'd given him that chance. "Name it," Rodney said. "Jan Mays' properties. All of them. I want full inspections, every code and regulation in the book." There was a pause. "That's a lot of properties, and the Mays family has connections." "I know. That's why I'm asking you. You can't be bought, and you owe me nothing but the truth." Another pause, longer this time. "I heard something happened to your daughter. One of the nurses at the hospital is my cousin's wife. Then you know why I'm asking." Rodney's voice hardened. "Inspections start tomorrow." On December 28th, Hannah Mays Bryant filed for divorce. She did not do this voluntarily. She did it because her father told her to. Cut ties. Jan had instructed her during an emergency family meeting. That man is becoming a liability. If he makes noise about what happened, we need to be able to portray him as a disgruntled ex-husband fabricating accusations. But the custody will be handled. I have judges who understand the value of a Mays grandchild being raised properly. Hannah signed the papers her father's attorneys prepared. She did not see Emma before the papers were filed. She did not call. Carol received the documents from Jeremiah with something approaching relief. "She took the bait," Jeremiah said. "By filing first, she's put herself and her family on the offensive. That's going to look very bad when we reveal our evidence. When do we file our countersuit? Not yet. Let them think they're winning. Let them get comfortable." Orlando's first report came on December 30th. "Shane Mays," he began, spreading photographs across the motel room's cramped desk, "is having an affair with his assistant, woman named Nicole Sellers. They meet at a rental property on Oak Street, one that's supposed to be vacant, according to company records." Carol studied the photographs. Shane entering the building, Nicole arriving minutes later, both leaving hours after, disheveled and obvious. Leverage for later? More than that. The property is classified as uninhabitable. It was condemned after a fire last year. If Shane's been hiding there for his trysts, he's been lying on insurance forms, tax documents, and probably a dozen other things. Good. What about Candace? Orlando smiled without warmth. That's where it gets interesting. Candace Mays has been stealing from her in-laws for years. I found accounts in her maiden name, Douglas, with deposits that trace back to Mays company properties. Rent payments that should have gone to the family are being siphoned into her personal fund. Does Jan know? No. And I think Candace is waiting for the right moment to disappear. She's got plane tickets booked to Switzerland for January 15th. One way. Carol felt the first stirring of something that might have been satisfaction. The Mays family imagined themselves as predators, but they were really just thieves and cheats who'd never been held accountable. Every predator had weaknesses. Carol had spent 20 years learning to find them. Ruth Mays, Orlando continued. Harder to get dirt on. She lives in Jan's shadow completely. But I did find something concerning, medical records from 20 years ago. She was hospitalized for accidental injuries multiple times during the early years of her marriage. Jan beat her. Almost certainly. She's been his victim longer than anyone else. Might be worth considering whether she's an ally or an enemy. Carol shook his head. She watched my daughter bleed on her kitchen floor and went back to her embroidery. Whatever she suffered doesn't excuse what she allowed to happen. Orlando nodded, respecting the boundary. And Jan himself? That's what I'm working on. The building inspections start tomorrow. But there's more, older stuff from before he built the current company. I found references to a business partner named Tomas Conley who died under suspicious circumstances in 1987. Jan was questioned, but never charged. Murder, insurance fraud at minimum. But I need proof, and any records are either destroyed or buried in county archives. I can dig, then dig. January 1st arrived cold and gray. Carol spent New Year's Eve with Emma, who had been released from the hospital into his temporary custody while the divorce proceedings began. They watched movies in his small apartment, ate pizza, and pretended that everything was normal. At midnight, Emma was asleep on the couch, a blanket tucked around her. Carol stepped onto his balcony and watched fireworks explode over the city, their colors reflected in the snow. He thought about the year ahead, the battles he would fight, the lines he would cross. His phone buzzed. A text from Jeremiah. Building inspection results in multiple major violations. Jan Mays is about to have a very bad week. Carol allowed himself a small smile. It was the first of many bad weeks to come. The building inspections hit the Mays company like a hammer. Rodney Bonner had been thorough. Over 70 properties were flagged for violations ranging from faulty wiring to structural deficiencies to mold that created genuine health hazards. 14 buildings were immediately condemned, their tenants forced to relocate, their rent payments halted. Jan Mays' attorneys scrambled to contain the damage, but Rodney had been meticulous in his documentation. Every violation was photographed, measured, and logged. Every attempt to offer bribes had been recorded and reported to the State Ethics Board. Who authorized this? Jan demanded during an emergency meeting with his lawyers. I have friends on the county board. This should have been handled quietly. The inspector is former military, one attorney replied. Bonner, his record is spotless, and he's refused every offer we've made. Worse, he's filed complaints about the offers, so now there's a paper trail showing attempted bribery. Jan's face purpled with rage. Find something. Everyone has something. But Rodney Bonner was exactly who Carol had known him to be. Incorruptible. He'd served his country, nearly died in an accident, and been saved by a man who asked only for honesty in return. There was nothing to find. On January 5th, the Mays family's carefully constructed image began to crumble publicly. It started with a news story. A local reporter named Gail Gill had received an anonymous tip about the building violations, along with testimonials from former tenants who'd been evicted without proper notice. The story aired at 6 o'clock, complete with footage of the condemned buildings and interviews with families who'd lost their homes. We tried to complain, one woman said on camera, tears streaming down her face. But every time we called, they threatened us. Said they'd make sure we never rented anywhere in the city again. By the next morning, the story had spread. National outlets picked it up, hungry for a tale of wealthy cruelty during the holiday season. The Mays family name, once synonymous with charity galas and community involvement, became shorthand for corruption. Shane Mays was photographed leaving his office building, looking haggard and hunted. Candace Mays canceled her Switzerland tickets. Jan Mays did not appear in public at all. But Carol wasn't finished. The building violations were just the opening salvo, public pressure designed to destabilize. The real work was still to come. On January 8th, he met with Jeremiah again. CPS is investigating, Jeremiah reported. The photographs you provided, combined with the medical records and Emma's statement, have been forwarded to the district attorney's office. Will they press charges? That depends on whether the Mays family's influence extends into the DA's office. My guess is it does, but with this much public scrutiny, they'll have to at least make a show of taking it seriously. Carol nodded slowly. Then we need to make sure they can't make it go away. Ow! Carol pulled out a folder, the third and final piece of his puzzle. Tomas Conley, he said, Jan's former business partner, died in 1987 in what was ruled an accident. Insurance payout went to January. Jeremiah's eyes sharpened. You found something? Orlando found something. Specifically, he found Tomas Conley's widow, Tabitha Conley, She'd remarried and become Tabitha Bird, was 71 years old, and living in a retirement community 3 hours away. She'd spent 36 years believing her husband's death was an accident, carrying grief that had never fully healed. Until Orlando Long showed up with questions. He was pushed, Tabitha said during their recorded conversation, her voice steady with old anger. I always knew it, but I couldn't prove it. The police didn't want to investigate a prominent businessman. Jan Mays was already wealthy by then, already connected. My husband was just a carpenter who'd had the bad luck to become his partner. Do you have any evidence? Orlando asked. Tabitha reached into a drawer and pulled out a yellowed envelope. Tomas kept records of everything. He didn't trust Jan, said there was something wrong with him, something cold behind his eyes. When he died, I hid these because I was afraid of what Jan would do if he found out I had them. The envelope contained documents. Financial records showing that Jan had been stealing from the partnership for years, forging Tomas's signature on contracts, draining accounts into shell companies. If Tomas had lived and discovered the theft, Jan would have gone to prison. Instead, Tomas had fallen from a construction scaffold 2 days before a scheduled audit. This is enough to reopen the case, Orlando said carefully. Are you willing to come forward? Tabitha's eyes, clouded with cataracts but still sharp, met his. That man killed my husband and never suffered a single consequence. If you can make him pay, I'll testify on live television if I have to. January 12th became the day everything changed. Carol had orchestrated events carefully, layering revelations to maximum effect. The building violations had damaged the Mays family's reputation. The CPS investigation had created legal jeopardy, but neither was enough to truly destroy them, not while they still had money and connections. The Conley documents changed everything. Jeremiah Blair filed a wrongful death lawsuit on behalf of Tabitha Bird, simultaneously forwarding the evidence to the state attorney general's office. The documents proved financial fraud, but more critically, they established a pattern. Jan Mays had been willing to kill to protect his secrets decades ago. What had he done since? The same day, Gail Gill aired a follow-up story featuring exclusive interviews with former Mays Company employees who'd witnessed abuse, corruption, and intimidation over the years. One woman described how Jan had threatened her children when she tried to report safety violations. Another man revealed how he'd been paid to lie to investigators after a worker died on a construction site in 2009. By nightfall, the Mays mansion was surrounded by news vans. Jan's attorneys issued a statement denying everything, but their voices were drowned out by the avalanche of accusations. Shane Mays, panicked and desperate, made a critical mistake. He called Carol directly. "You did this." Shane's voice was shaking with rage. "I don't know how, but you did this." Carol was sitting in his apartment, Emma asleep in the next room, the phone pressed to his ear. He felt nothing, no anger, no satisfaction, just cold, patient certainty. "Tell me something, Shane. When you set up those nails on your father's kitchen floor, did you think about what it would feel like? Did you imagine an 8-year-old child kneeling on them, bleeding, crying, begging for help while you went back to your Christmas dinner?" She needed to learn respect. She needed to be protected. By her mother, by her grandmother, by anyone with a shred of humanity. Instead, you made her kneel for 40 minutes and then stepped over her unconscious body. Shane's breathing was ragged. "What do you want? Money? We can make this all go away. The investigations, the lawsuits. We have resources you can't imagine." Carol smiled in the darkness. "I don't want your money, Shane. I want you to understand something. Everything that's happening to your family right now, the inspections, the news stories, the lawsuits, this is just the beginning. I haven't even started making you pay yet. You can't threaten." "I'm not threatening. I'm explaining. Your father tortured my daughter on Christmas Eve. Your family watched and did nothing. Now I'm going to dismantle everything you've ever built, everything you've ever valued, everything you've ever loved. And when it's over, you're going to kneel on the floor of a prison cell and understand exactly what Emma felt." Carol hung up. The dissolution of the Mays family began not with a bang, but with a cascade of whimpers. Candace was the first to break. On January 15th, the date she'd originally planned to flee to Switzerland, She instead walked into the district attorney's office with her attorney and a 30-page statement detailing every crime she'd witnessed during her 15 years as a Mays family member. "I want immunity," she said flatly. "Full immunity for myself and my children. In exchange, I'll give you everything." Everything included financial records she'd stolen over the years as insurance. Recordings of conversations where Jan discussed bribing officials. Photographs of Shane's numerous affairs, including several with women who'd been pressured into compliance through threats against their careers. And most damning of all, Candace had been present when Jan Mays discussed the Conley problem with his attorneys in 2004. She'd heard him joke about how easy it had been to push Tomas off that scaffold, how stupid the police had been to rule an accident. He was proud of it, Candace told investigators. He said it was the moment he knew he could do anything and get away with it. The arrest of Jan Mays occurred on January 18th, early in the morning, while news cameras broadcast every moment live. He was 73 years old, accustomed to deference and respect, and completely unprepared for the sight of uniformed officers on his property. Ruth Mays watched from an upstairs window as her husband of 50 years was handcuffed and led to a waiting car, his face a mask of outraged disbelief. "Do you know who I am?" he shouted at the officers. "I built this city. I'll have your badges." The officers said nothing. They'd heard it before from men just like him. Shane was arrested the same day, at his office, in front of the employees he'd terrorized for years. When he was led past the reception desk, his former assistant Nicole Sellers was standing there, arms crossed, a small smile on her face. She'd been the one to provide investigators with details about the condemned Oak Street property and the insurance fraud it represented. Carol watched the arrests on television with Emma beside him. "Is that Grandpa?" Emma asked quietly, watching Jan being put into the police car. "Yes." "Is he going to jail?" "Yes, baby. He is." Emma was silent for a moment. Then good. She turned back to her coloring book, and Carol felt something loosen in his chest. His daughter was going to be okay. She was stronger than the people who tried to break her. The trial of Jan Mays began in March and lasted 6 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming. Candace's testimony, combined with the Conley documents and the financial record Orlando had uncovered, painted a picture of a man who'd spent 50 years treating laws as suggestions and people as obstacles to be removed. Tabitha Bird took the stand on the 4th day. At 71, she was frail but fierce, her voice clear as she described her husband's final days. "Tomas knew something was wrong," she said. "He'd found discrepancies in the books and was going to confront Jan about them. 2 days before the meeting, he fell from a scaffold he'd climbed 100 times before. Jan's attorneys tried to discredit her, but there was nothing to discredit. She was a widow who'd waited 36 years for justice, and the jury saw exactly that." Carol testified on the 5th day. He described the Christmas Eve incident in clinical detail. Emma's injuries, her whispered account of what had happened, the blood he'd found on the kitchen floor when he'd retrieved her. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't cry. He simply told the truth and let the horror of it speak for itself. "Mr. Bryant," the prosecutor asked, "what did you do when you discovered what had been done to your daughter?" Carol met the eyes of each juror in turn. "I decided that justice wasn't going to come from the system. The Mays family had spent decades buying their way out of consequences. So I gathered evidence. I found witnesses. I made sure that when the truth finally came out, there would be nowhere for them to hide. Some might call that vigilantism. Some might. I call it protecting my child." Jan Mays was convicted on 14 counts, including first-degree murder in the death of Tomas Conley, multiple counts of fraud, and conspiracy to commit child abuse. The jury deliberated for 3 hours before returning their verdict. At sentencing, Jan finally lost his composure. "This is a travesty," he screamed as bailiffs moved to restrain him. "I built this city. I employed thousands of people, and you're going to let some ambulance driver and a bitter widow destroy everything." The judge, a woman named Carolina Dunlap, who'd been specifically assigned to the case because she had no connections to the Mays family, looked at him without expression. "Mr. Mays, you murdered a man to protect your financial interests. You tortured an 8-year-old child because she defended her father. You spent 50 years believing that wealth placed you above consequence. You were wrong. She sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Shane Mays received 20 years for his role in Emma's abuse and his involvement in the company's numerous frauds. During his sentencing hearing, he wept and begged for mercy, claiming he'd only been following his father's orders. The judge was unmoved. "You were a grown man," she said. "You had choices. You chose to set up those nails. You chose to watch a child suffer. You don't get to hide behind your father now." Ruth Mays was not charged criminally. The DA decided there was insufficient evidence to prove active participation in any specific crime. But the civil lawsuit Carol filed on Emma's behalf named her as a defendant, and the jury found her liable for negligence and failure to protect. She lost everything: the mansion, the investments, the charitable foundations that had been her only source of social standing. At 71, Ruth Mays was forced to move into a modest apartment and live on a fixed income, stripped of every comfort she'd ever known. Some thought this was too lenient. Carol disagreed. "She spent 50 years in that man's shadow," he told Jeremiah after the verdict. "Everything she had came from him, and everything she had been beaten out of her. Losing it all is worse than prison for her. She has to live with what she allowed to happen." Anna's fate was perhaps the most complicated. She'd been complicit in Emma's abuse through inaction, but she'd also been a victim of the same family dynamics that had shaped her into a person capable of watching her child suffer. The CPS investigation found her unfit for custody, and the court awarded full parental rights to Carol. But Hannah wasn't sent to prison. Instead, at Carol's request, she was ordered to complete an intensive residential therapy program. The same program her father had refused to let her attend when she'd first shown signs of breaking down under his control 20 years earlier. "Why?" Jeremiah asked when Carol made the request. After everything she did, Carol thought about it for a long time. "Because Emma is going to grow up asking about her mother. And I want to be able to tell her that Hannah got help, that she tried to become a better person. Even if she failed, even if she never sees Emma again, I want there to be a chance at redemption. You're a better man than I would be." "No, I'm just a father." In the aftermath, Carol Bryant's life changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. The media attention brought scrutiny, some of it unwelcome. A few commentators questioned whether his methods had been ethical, whether he'd crossed lines in his pursuit of justice. One op-ed called him a vigilante in paramedics' clothing. Carol didn't read the coverage. He was too busy rebuilding. He kept his job at Station 47, where his co-workers treated him with a quiet respect that he hadn't asked for but didn't reject. Marcus Webb told everyone who would listen about how Carol had kept working his shifts even while orchestrating the takedown of one of the city's most powerful families. "Man's ice cold," Marcus would say admiringly. "Never seen anything like it." Orlando long stayed in town, longer than either brother had expected. They spent evenings together, catching up on years of separation, building a relationship that had been fractured by circumstance and neglect. Orlando taught Emma how to fish in the river outside town. Carol taught Orlando how to cook something other than canned soup and microwave dinners. "You could stay," Carol said one evening. "Get a place here. Actually have a family for once." Orlando smiled, but there was something sad in it. "Maybe someday. I've got too much road in me still. But I'll visit. Often." He left in April, but he called every week, and he was there for Emma's 9th birthday in June, carrying a telescope he'd spent 3 months' salary on because he remembered she loved astronomy. Tabitha Bird died peacefully in August, 8 months after the trial ended. She'd lived long enough to see Jan Mays behind bars, long enough to watch his empire crumble, long enough to know that her husband's death had finally been avenged. In her will, she left a small bequest to Carol. Not money, but Tomas Conley's tools, the ones he'd used as a carpenter before his partnership with Jan. He would have wanted them to go to someone who builds things up instead of tearing them down, her note explained. Use them well. Carol hung the tools in his garage and taught Emma how to use them. On the first anniversary of that terrible Christmas Eve, Carol and Emma drove past the Mays mansion. It was empty now, seized by creditors and awaiting sale. The windows were dark, the gardens overgrown, the Christmas lights that once blazed from every surface gone forever. It looked smaller than Carol remembered, diminished by abandonment. "Dad," Emma said from the passenger seat. "Can we stop?" Carol pulled over, uncertain what his daughter intended. Emma got out of the truck and stood at the edge of the property, looking at the house where she'd been tortured. She was quiet for a long time. Then she picked up a stone from the driveway and threw it as hard as she could at the front window. The glass shattered with a satisfying crash. "Feel better?" Carol asked. Emma turned to him, and for the first time in a year, her smile reached all the way to her eyes. "Yeah," she said, "I really do." They drove home together, leaving the broken window behind, leaving the ghosts of the Mays family to rot in their empty mansion. Carol Bryant had come to this city 20 years ago, alone and hungry and determined to build something meaningful. He'd become a paramedic because he wanted to save lives, wanted to be the person who showed up in the worst moments and made things better. For 8 years, he'd failed the person who mattered most. He'd watched the woman he married become a stranger. He'd let his daughter be pulled into an orbit of cruelty he couldn't escape. Then, on the worst night of his life, he'd finally stopped waiting for justice to arrive and had gone out to find it himself. He wasn't a hero. Heroes didn't do the things he'd done, didn't manipulate and scheme and destroy families for revenge. But he was a father who'd protected his child, and that was enough. In the truck's rearview mirror, the Mays mansion disappeared around a curve, and Carol didn't look back. Ahead of them, the road was open, and the future was whatever they chose to make it. 5 years later, Emma Bryant graduated from middle school at the top of her class. She gave a speech that day about resilience, about how the worst things that happen to us don't have to define us, about how scars can become sources of strength instead of shame. She didn't mention her grandparents by name, but everyone who knew the story understood. Carol sat in the audience with Orlando beside him, both of them pretending they weren't crying. Afterward, Emma ran to her father and threw her arms around him. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Carol held his daughter and thought about Christmas Eve's past, about the sound of her voice on the phone that terrible night, about the cold fury that had driven him through the months that followed. He thought about Jan Mays, rotting in a prison cell, and Shane Mays, counting down the years until parole. He thought about Ruth Mays in her tiny apartment, and Candace Mays in witness protection somewhere, and Hannah Mays in a facility that might never release her. He thought about Tomas Conley, finally at rest, and Tabitha Bird, reunited with her husband at last. And he thought about the man he'd become, harder than he'd been, darker in some ways, but also more certain. He knew now that he would do anything to protect his daughter, cross any line, burn any bridge. That knowledge didn't trouble him. Some bridges deserve to burn. "I love you, Dad," Emma said. Carol smiled, holding her close. "I love you too, baby. Always." Above them, the June sun was warm and golden, and the future spread out before them like an open road, waiting to be traveled. They walked toward it together. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.